You may be wondering, unknowingly, if your money is being diverted to fund an agenda you never chose to support. Prepare for a shocking revelation that could change the way you view your daily transactions. With every purchase you make, every service you use, you may be inadvertently feeding a well-oiled machine that supports causes that hide under the cloak of social responsibility but, in reality, promote a carefully orchestrated, woke agenda. Imagine this: your seemingly innocent everyday purchases are actually the tip of a hidden funding iceberg. What's behind this secret, woke tax you never knew you were paying? Let's unravel this enigma, which begins with corporate practices that, at first glance, seem harmless or even beneficial. However, hidden beneath lies a complex scheme that directs funds to organizations and causes you would never consciously support. Giant corporations that dominate the market and the consumer mind have created a system where part of their profits, and therefore part of their money, is channeled into initiatives that promote progressive ideologies. These investments are often disguised as corporate social responsibility efforts, a marketing strategy aimed at enhancing these corporations' public image while alienating a significant portion of their customers. But how is this possible? The answer lies in the way these companies integrate their financial operations with entities that advocate progressive policies. When purchasing shares, products, or services, a fraction of their payment is redirected through donations, sponsorships, and partnerships that directly fund these causes. Companies avoid direct accountability while ensuring that their financial statements support this agenda. What makes it all even more disturbing is the lack of transparency. Information about exactly where this money goes is murky at best. Corporations release sustainability and social impact reports with carefully crafted language that often omits critical details about the ultimate beneficiaries of their social investments. And that's when the truth begins to unfold, a truth that executives prefer to keep hidden from the public. To illustrate the magnitude of this phenomenon, consider the collaborations between major brands and purpose-built NGOs. These organizations are fueled by corporate funds that should be used to improve communities and support genuinely altruistic causes. However, this capital is often ultimately channeled into a political agenda that seeks to insidiously transform the cultural landscape. And while you watch commercials promoting diversity and inclusion, the same brands are, behind the scenes, funding movements that don't necessarily reflect the values of society as a whole. The irony is palpable. Unsuspecting consumers' money is being used to shape a new social order under the umbrella of progress and social justice. Now, as you process this information, questions mount. How deep is this system? How many companies are involved? And, most importantly, how can we, as consumers, regain control over the fate of our own money? As these questions begin to simmer, we set the stage for delving even deeper into this maze of hidden corporate finance, where the truth awaits to be uncovered. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the threads of this complex web. The smokescreen has been lifted. What we're told is a noble mission of wealth redistribution and social investment hides a dark and distorted truth. Corporate taxes, which were supposed to support the common good and strengthen infrastructure, have been redirected to causes that serve private interests, manipulating the fate of billions of dollars. Let's examine the workings of this perverse mechanism. We're sold the myth that every penny paid in taxes by corporations is a direct contribution to the healthy functioning of society. Roads, schools, and hospitals, they say, are funded by these essential funds. But while the facade is maintained with rhetoric of social responsibility and corporate ethics, the reality is that a significant portion of this money is channeled into initiatives that have little to do with public well-being. We investigated the deviations and found an alarming pattern. Large corporations, true titans of capitalism, have been exploiting loopholes and shady partnerships to direct resources to groups and causes aligned with a specific political agenda. This is the true face of the woke tax, an informal and ideologically driven taxation system masked by the appearance of legality and fiscal fairness. Financial reports, often deliberately complicated, hide these transactions amid figures and technical language. Audits that should ensure transparency end up being just another tool in the hands of those who know how to manipulate the system. And so, money that should feed the public health system or improve crumbling infrastructure ends up funding campaigns and organizations that promote a narrow ideological agenda, often alien to the interests of the majority. The bitter irony is that while corporations proudly proclaim their contributions to social development, they simultaneously undermine the very foundations of the society they claim to support. The rhetoric is one thing, but the practice is another. And who pays the price for this duplicity? It is we, the ordinary citizens, who witness unfulfilled promises and see public services deteriorating day by day. As we delve deeper, we realize that this distortion of corporate taxes is systematically fueled by a vicious cycle of political and economic influence. Governments, often complicit, turn a blind eye to these agreements, whether out of self-interest or inescapable pressure from lobbyists. These power brokers, instead of protecting the public interest, become guardians of corporations, sacrificing the common good on the altar of private gain. It's clear that what was sold to us as a system of fair and equitable contributions is, in fact, a web of personal and political interests. A scheme where money, which should bring progress and support to society, is diverted to fuel an agenda we didn't choose and often don't understand. And as injustice grows, the official narrative continues to repeat itself, with promises of a better future that never arrives. But we cannot deceive ourselves. What's at stake is more than money and infrastructure. It's the very trust in the system that should protect and serve us. As we unravel this plot, we find more questions than answers. Who really benefits from this hidden redistribution of wealth? And, more importantly, who is behind this subtle but powerful manipulation of corporate taxes? The answers are yet to come, but be prepared, the truth may be more disturbing than we imagine. In the hushed halls of universities in the 1980s, where economists debated theories that would shape the world, there was a man who walked against the tide. His name was John Doe, and he was an economist with a clear vision and an unwavering mission to reveal what seemed like an inconvenient and dangerously underestimated truth. John was not just an academic, he was a detective in a world of numbers, a man who saw beyond the charts and graphs to uncover a scheme that threatened the very foundations of the American economy. Doe began noticing disturbing patterns while analyzing the financial reports of large corporations. He noticed transactions that made no apparent economic sense. There was a dance of numbers that escaped the untrained eye, but to John, it was a warning sign. He saw a flow of resources that seemed to deviate from their stated purposes, channeling them to entities and causes that, on the surface, had no connection to traditional business interests. What John Doe was about to discover was a shadowy funding system, carefully camouflaged between operating expenses and philanthropic donations. Money that should have been returning to investors or reinvested in development was actually being redistributed to support agendas and organizations that promoted ideals not discussed in boardrooms. With fierce determination, John began compiling evidence. He delved into reams of documents, cross-referencing data with a precision only a true researcher could muster. With each page turned, the plot became clearer, more sinister. John saw that corporations were becoming complicit, perhaps unwitting, but complicit nonetheless, in the promotion of an ideology that promised to profoundly change society. However, the path of a whistleblower is lonely and dangerous. When John tried to bring his findings to the public, he encountered resistance at every turn. Newspaper editors dismissed him as an alarmist, fellow academics accused him of sensationalism, and corporations, well, they simply denied it. It was as if a curtain of silence had been carefully orchestrated to stifle any mention of his research. But John Doe didn't stay silent. He continued to write, to speak, to try to alert those around him to what was at stake. For him, this wasn't just a matter of numbers, it was a matter of principles, of justice, and transparency. He knew he was fighting not just an economic system, but a tide of indifference and complacency that threatened to swallow the truth. Despite his efforts, John was relegated to the margins, his discoveries were ignored or ridiculed. But he had planted a seed, an idea, that could not be easily eradicated. Every word written, every lecture given, was a building block in the construction of a resistance that, he hoped, would one day emerge to challenge the status quo. And so, John Doe faded into obscurity, a forgotten hero in a world unwilling to listen. But his story doesn't end there. On the contrary, it's merely a prelude to something greater. His discoveries would be rediscovered, his theories revisited, and his legacy revived by those inspired by his courage, who would rise up to continue the fight. What he began in the 1980s was only the beginning of a revelation that, years later, would be impossible to ignore. The truth had been sown, and was about to blossom. In the frenetic whirlwind of corporate finance, where numbers become weapons and balance sheets become shields, a lone man stood against the dark colossus. John, a meticulous data analyst, was no ordinary hero. He moved in the shadows, guided by a sharp intuition and an unwavering passion for justice. It was one silent night, while sifting through stacks of tax reports from major corporations, that he stumbled upon something that would forever change the course of his investigation. The numbers, cold and seemingly innocuous, told a disturbing story. Amidst columns of figures, a strange discrepancy emerged. Small, almost imperceptible variations, but when added together, they created a disturbing pattern. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing an intricate game of manipulation and power. John knew he couldn't ignore these signs. What he had uncovered could be the tip of an iceberg of corporate corruption and hypocrisy. Armed with his discovery, he began tracing the flow of money. Millions were being cunningly diverted through subsidiaries and shadowy funds. But where exactly was this stream of capital being channeled? The answers lay buried in annual reports, forgotten footnotes, and closed-door meetings. John realized he was dealing with something much bigger than a simple accounting error. He was about to expose a system that used corporate finance as a tool of ideological control. As he deepened his investigation, John stumbled upon a pattern of donations and sponsorships that seemed to defy corporate logic. Significant sums were being funneled to organizations and causes championing progressive agendas, all under the guise of corporate social responsibility. It was the so-called woke tax, a secret fee companies paid to maintain a facade of progress and inclusion while fueling a political machine. The implications were staggering. Shareholders' and consumers' money was being used to fund movements that, in theory, should be independent of corporate interests. John was witnessing a scheme where corporations, under the guise of adhering to social values, were, in practice, manipulating the political and cultural landscape as they pleased. The truth was clear and brutal: the system was corrupt, and corporations were its accomplices. But John faced powerful forces. Companies that dominated global markets would not hesitate to crush those who threatened their secrets. He knew he needed to be careful, strategic. Every step was now crucial. The line between truth and danger was thin, and he had to walk it with surgical precision. He began gathering evidence, building a dossier that would withstand the most rigorous scrutiny. John knew the battle was just beginning. What he had in his hands was more than a financial discrepancy, it was a weapon to challenge the status quo. But time was short, and the pressure was mounting. He was facing not just corporations, but an entire system that protected its own interests at any cost. Tensions were rising, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. John needed allies, he needed time, but above all, he needed courage. The truth was about to emerge, but the world was unprepared for what was to come. The stage was set, and the battle royale was just beginning. What was truly at stake was the very definition of justice in an era of rampant corporate manipulation. The silence, once comforting, now seemed an unsettling prelude to the coming storm. At the heart of the unfolding battle lies John, a fearless financial analyst who dared to challenge the status quo. Amidst charts and balance sheets, he unearths a scheme as audacious as it is insidious, an invisible tax, created and fueled by the largest corporations, that silently drains consumers' money to finance a specific political agenda. But when John decides to bring this truth to light, he encounters a wall of silence and resistance that threatens not only his career but also his personal safety. John, armed with irrefutable data, prepares an explosive report designed to expose the collusion between big business and left-wing ideological interests. He hopes to find support among his peers, believing that a revelation of such magnitude cannot be ignored. However, the reality he finds is quite different. His report, rather than being celebrated as a beacon of truth, is strangled in its initial phase. In closed-door meetings, he is met with cold, evasive stares and rehearsed responses that insist on the lack of merit in his findings. The justifications are always vague. Lack of concrete evidence, some say. This could result in unintended legal consequences, others murmur. The resistance is palpable, but it's not just the lack of support that begins to surround John, it's the veiled threats that begin to infiltrate his daily life. Anonymous phone calls, strange emails, and unknown vehicles parked outside his house at night. The message is clear: there are powerful forces that don't want this truth to come to light, and they are willing to do whatever it takes to silence John. The pressure intensifies when John notices his allies starting to distance themselves. Colleagues who once supported him now avoid contact. His superiors, who initially expressed interest in his discoveries, suddenly change their tune, suggesting he take a vacation or reconsider his priorities. It's a devastating blow, but it's also a clear sign that he's on the right track, that his discoveries are dangerous to those who benefit from this corrupt system. And so, John finds himself alone in the trenches, fighting an invisible enemy that seems to be everywhere and nowhere. He understands that the battle now is not just for the truth, but for his own professional and personal survival. He must decide, give up and remain safe, or continue, aware of the risks he faces. Each choice he makes is a step into the unknown, a tense move on a chessboard where the pieces are manipulated by invisible hands. The silence and betrayal surrounding him are suffocating, but John is determined. He knows this fight is bigger than him, bigger than any of us. The system he's challenging isn't just an economic mechanism, it's a well-oiled power machine that cries on silence and conformity. And that's exactly what he refuses to surrender. Amid threats and isolation, he begins to seek new ways to share his discoveries, exploring avenues that don't rely on the institutions now trying to stifle him. But as John moves forward, a question resonates in his mind: how far are they willing to go to keep him silent? The answers to that question remain in the mists of the unknown, waiting to be uncovered. And as the clock continues to tick, he braces himself for what may come next, knowing the battle is far from over. The clash between truth and power is just beginning, and the world is about to see if one man's courage can turn the tide against a system that seems invincible. The spotlight dimmed, and John disappeared from the headlines. But the battle was far from won. Behind the scenes, an even more sinister power play was unfolding, with corporations using John's silence as a smokescreen to continue funding political agendas. The crucial question was, how did they manage to do this under the guise of legal fees? In a maze of opaque figures and transactions, corporations disguised their intentions under the guise of legitimate investments. The trick was in the subtlety. Through donations to foundations and nonprofits, they were able to divert money to political causes without arousing suspicion. These funds, disguised as philanthropy, were nothing less than financial ammunition for an ideological war. And most disturbingly, all of this happened with the tacit approval of a complicit regulatory system. Loopholes in campaign finance and corporate spending laws were exploited with surgical precision. To the average citizen, these donations were just numbers in annual reports, but to shadowy actors, they were gateways to power. John's silence was not only a personal misfortune, but an unheeded warning sign. His voice, which once echoed like a powerful denunciation, was now just a distant echo, muffled by confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure agreements. With him out of the way, corporations found a clear path to perpetuate their scheme. And, like a virus spreading unchecked, the woke tax infiltrated every level of the corporate structure. Company boardrooms and shareholder meetings became venues for decisions that, while ostensibly focused on profit, in fact perpetuated a carefully orchestrated political agenda. Under the guise of corporate social responsibility, these actions were not only accepted but celebrated. In luxurious boardrooms, hidden from the public eye, executives discussed financing strategies that, while legally defensible, were ethically questionable. With John silenced, there was no one left to openly challenge these practices. Corporations, with their armies of lawyers, were always one step ahead, manipulating a system that seemed tailored to their interests. Yet there was something in the air, a palpable tension. The truth is, try as they might, they couldn't control every aspect of this narrative. Small leaks of information began to emerge, anonymous complaints, leaked documents, whispers of dissatisfaction within the corporations themselves. The feeling that something big was about to happen hung in the air, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The corporate machinery was turning, but sand was beginning to gather in its wheels. The public, eager for justice and clarity, was beginning to realize that John's silence was not a sign of corporate victory, but an alarm that the system was failing. And so, the stage was set for the next act. Corporations continued to play their dangerous game, but the burning question was, how much longer could they maintain this charade? John's silence could be just the beginning of a collective awakening, a prelude to an even greater battle. Something was about to happen, and the world waited in suspense for this corporate drama to unfold. Imagine a world where your money is used to fund causes you'd never imagine supporting. A world where corporations, under the guise of social responsibility, direct enormous sums toward agendas that may not reflect their values or priorities. Sadly, this world is our current reality. And this is where the so-called woke tax comes into play, silently diverting billions toward goals that remain hidden from view. Behind the scenes at corporate giants, decisions are made in opaque meetings, where a handful of executives determine the fate of substantial funds. These resources, which should benefit consumers, employees, and shareholders, are redirected to causes that, under the guise of social progress, serve specific and sometimes questionable interests. The promise of a more inclusive and just future is seductive. However, the reality can be quite different. Recent investigations reveal that these corporations not only sympathize with progressive socio-political movements, but also often become financiers of an agenda that is not aligned with what the majority of their consumers believe or desire. The facade of corporate social responsibility, which initially seemed like a laudable initiative, conceals a system that collects financial contributions indirectly, without the conscious approval of consumers. Donations are labeled as investments in diversity, equity, and inclusion, terms that, on the surface, no one would dare criticize. But what actually happens when the money changes hands? Where are these funds actually being spent? The lack of transparency is alarming. Without clear accountability, consumers remain in the dark, unaware of the fate of their involuntary contributions. The strategy is simple but effective. Use emotional engagement to secure donations, or rather, investments, by manipulating consumers' goodwill. With a carefully constructed narrative, corporations justify their actions under the guise of a moral commitment. However, this smokescreen has left many wondering, how much of this is genuine, and how much is a power play? But the more disturbing question is, why do these corporations feel compelled to fund agendas that are not transparent to the public? The answer may lie in the political connections and power these donations grant. On the one hand, they provide financial support to movements, and on the other, they secure political favors that perpetuate their influence and market dominance. And while all this is happening, the average consumer continues to pay the price, unaware that part of their purchase is being siphoned off to causes they may not support. The true cost of the woke tax lies not only in the product they buy, but in the impact it has on the social and political fabric. The reality is that with every transaction, with every product purchased, there may be an involuntary contribution to a system that isn't being questioned. And the longer it remains this way, the more distant the possibility of true control over where and how money is used becomes. As we unravel this complex web of influences and interests, one question remains: how long will we continue to fund, without consent, an agenda we did not choose? The answer may be closer than we imagine, but it takes courage and determination to unearth the truth and demand transparency. Brace yourself, because the revelations that follow may be even more surprising. In a world where transparency should be the norm, we've uncovered a veil of opacity that shrouds shady corporate practices. Companies you know, trust, and perhaps even admire are, in fact, engaged in a behind-the-scenes game that few dare question. A thorough investigation reveals that giants like XYZ have been transforming their alleged social contributions into disguised political investments, betraying public trust and manipulating the system for their own ends. At first glance, these corporations' annual reports and press releases seem harmless, replete with promises of social responsibility and sustainable community commitments. But behind the carefully chosen words and attractive figures lies a disturbing truth. These donations are not simple acts of kindness or genuine philanthropy. They are, instead, pieces in a strategic chess game, moved with precision to influence public policy and consolidate power. In leaked internal documents and a thorough analysis of corporate finances, we found compelling evidence that XYZ, among others, has funneled resources to groups and initiatives that promote specific political agendas. These actions are masquerading as corporate social responsibility initiatives, but in reality, they represent a calculated investment in political influence. Sophisticated corporate terminology and technical jargon conceal their true nature. Terms like community partnerships and strategic collaborations are actually code for investments in lobbying and support for political candidates aligned with their corporate goals. Make no mistake, these are deliberate strategies. Corporations have adopted camouflage tactics, using nonprofit foundations as intermediaries to channel money toward political causes while maintaining a facade of neutrality and benevolence. We are lifting the curtain on practices that belie the meticulously constructed public image of these entities. And throughout this process, one question resonates strongly: how far do these networks of influence extend? Analysis of financial flows reveals an alarming pattern. Donations that appear to benefit local communities are actually destined for entities with a clear political agenda. XYZ, for example, has made contributions to organizations that, under the guise of social projects, promote policies that favor deregulation and grant tax breaks to the same corporations that fund them. It's a vicious cycle of power and money, where influence is bought and sold like any other commodity. The practice of disguising political donations as social responsibility is not only a betrayal of consumer and shareholder trust, but a fundamental distortion of democratic principles. Companies like XYZ are rewriting the rules of the game, using their immense financial power to shape the future of society according to their corporate interests. These revelations demand a critical reassessment of how we understand and regulate the interface between business and politics. As we unravel these disturbing connections, the true extent of this network of influence begins to emerge, raising urgent questions about corporate integrity and transparency. What other surprises do these annual reports hide? What are the next moves in this power game? What else is disguised under the seductive label of social contribution? The answers, as always, lie between the lines, and our next step is to keep digging. The curtains have opened, and the stage is set for one of the most shocking revelations of our time. The plot is unraveled, and the threads linking corporate power to ideological manipulation are exposed. The truth that emerges is clear, but disturbing. The money you spend, with sweat and sacrifice, is being redirected, without your consent, to fund agendas that often directly contradict your personal values. A hidden tax, an invisible tax, and agreed tax that hides in plain sight, masked by marketing campaigns and empty slogans of social responsibility. You, the common citizen, are being turned into a pawn in this power game. Corporations, under the guise of corporate social responsibility, are investing in causes that not only shape society according to specific ideals but also widen the gap between popular and corporate power. This is not a scenario built on theories. It is a reality sustained by documents, financial connections, and strategies that emerge from the shadows to seize control of public discourse. Your consumer choices, a decision that should be personal and free from external manipulation, have become a weapon in the hands of the powerful. Every product you purchase is a financial vote, an involuntary endorsement of causes you often didn't choose to support. And herein lies the system's greatest trick, transforming seemingly harmless decisions into substantial support for a carefully crafted agenda. But, contrary to what they would have you believe, you are not alone in this struggle. There is a growing awareness that something is terribly wrong. Revolt is growing, fueled by those who refuse to be mere spectators. The reality is that this is a game where the rules have changed, but the pieces remain the same. The difference now is knowledge, the ability to see beyond the surface and understand the true intentions behind the polite smiles and promises of a better future. The time to act is now. The truth, once known, cannot be ignored. It cries out for justice, for a redistribution of power that gives people back control over their choices and their voices. It's time to transform outrage into action, to use this knowledge as a tool to demand transparency and accountability from corporations that, until now, have operated with impunity. You hold the power to amplify this message, to join others who share this vision of a more just world, where conscious consumption becomes a revolutionary force. Your voice, when added to that of many others, can become a cry impossible to ignore. And that's exactly what they fear, a people informed, united, and determined not to be another piece on their board. As this truth spreads, the walls that support this power structure begin to crumble. But the fight is just beginning, and the resistance is intense. They will fight to maintain the status quo, to silence and discredit those who dare challenge the system. However, truth is a powerful force, and once it finds fertile ground, nothing can contain it. Your role in this movement is crucial, and the responsibility to act is inescapable. Make no mistake, the game is complex, but victory is possible. Collective awakening is a real threat to those who benefit from ignorance. Spread this knowledge, share this truth, and prepare for what comes next.